The crowd pressed against the barricades like a living wall, phones raised high, voices competing in the humid Virginia air. Fleet Week had transformed Norfolk Naval Base into a carnival of patriotism and spectacle, civilians jostling for glimpses of sailors in dress whites, Marines in their blues, the choreographed precision of a nation showing its strength. Among them, unnoticed, moved a woman in faded jeans and a plain black jacket, her dark hair pulled into a simple ponytail, no makeup, no jewelry, nothing to draw attention. She navigated the chaos with the efficiency of someone accustomed to hostile environments, her eyes scanning not the pageantry but the security gaps, the crowd flow, the subtle tells of professionals working the perimeter. She'd arrived early, before the speeches, before the formations, wanting to slip into the restricted zone without the ceremony her rank would demand. The Marine corporal at the VIP checkpoint didn't recognize her face. Why would he? The photographs that circulated in classified briefings never made it to public view, and the woman before him looked nothing like the mythical figure whispered about in the teams. She was maybe 5'6", 130 pounds, wearing civilian clothes that could have been purchased at any department store. When she attempted to pass the velvet rope without credentials visible, his hand shot out instinctively, palm against her shoulder, firm but not aggressive. "Ma'am, this area's restricted. You'll need to step back." His voice carried the polite authority of someone who delivered this line 1,000 times. She paused, looking at the hand on her shoulder with an expression that made something in his gut tighten. Not anger, not indignation, something colder, more measuring, like a calculator running probabilities. "I need to get through," she said quietly. The noise of the crowd swallowed her words. He shook his head, already turning his attention to the next potential breach, his grip tightening slightly to guide her backward. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. Civilian viewing is on the other side, Corporal." The word cut through the ambient roar with surgical precision, not loud but weighted with something that made his training kick in before his conscious mind caught up. His hand dropped. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't moved, but the air between them had changed in a way he couldn't articulate, the same way air changes before lightning strikes. Behind him, a Navy captain approaching the checkpoint stopped mid-stride, his face going pale as recognition hit like a freight train. The woman's eyes hadn't left the corporal's face, patient, waiting, giving him the chance to understand what was happening. The captain's movement was sharp, almost panicked, his polished shoes clicking against concrete as he closed the distance. "Admiral," he said, the word dropping into the space between them like a depth charge, and the corporal felt his stomach turn to ice water. His hand, which moments ago had been on her shoulder, now hung useless at his side, fingers numb. "Admiral." The Admiral held up one hand without breaking eye contact with the younger Marine, a gesture so casual it somehow made everything worse. "It's fine, Captain Richards." The corporal was doing his job. Her voice carried the same quiet weight, no anger, no irritation, just a statement of fact that made the corporal want to sink into the asphalt. Richards looked like he was calculating how quickly he could draft a formal apology. "Admiral Kestrel, I apologize. We should have coordinated your arrival. The security briefing didn't indicate. I didn't want it to." She finally looked away from the corporal, releasing him from that measured gaze, and he felt like he could breathe again even as his career flashed before his eyes. "I prefer to observe before being observed." She pulled a slim credential case from her jacket pocket, letting it fall open to reveal the identification that made Richard straighten further, and the corporal seriously consider whether the earth might spontaneously open beneath his feet. The photograph showed the same face, perhaps slightly younger, but the name stopped his heart. Vice Admiral J. Kestrel, Commander, Naval Special Warfare Command. The corporal had been in the Corps for 6 years. He'd done 2 tours, earned his stripes through sweat and sand, and he knew exactly what that title meant. Every SEAL team, every special boat unit, every piece of maritime special operations in the United States military answered ultimately to the officer standing before him. The officer he'd physically prevented from entering a military installation. the officer whose shoulder still probably bore the imprint of his palm. "Ma'am, he couldn't finish. What was there to say?" She was already moving past him, her stride unhurried, and Richards fell into step beside her, speaking in low, urgent tones about schedules and briefings and the CNO's expectations. The corporal stood frozen at his post, watching her disappear into the restricted zone, and became aware of the crowd still pressing behind him, oblivious to what had just transpired. A gunnery sergeant approached from the security tent, his face a mask of professional concern that barely concealed his amusement. "So Johnson, heard you just put hands on a 3-star. The corporal's mouth worked soundlessly. 3-star, vice admiral, commander of all naval special warfare. He'd shoved her, actually physically moved her. The gunny's expression softened slightly. "She really say it was fine?" When Johnson nodded, still mute, the gunny exhaled slowly. "Then it's fine, but son, you might want to learn what Admiral Kestrel looks like. That woman, she doesn't just command SEALs, she used to be one." The words didn't make sense. Johnson's brain, still processing the catastrophe, stumbled over the timeline, the physics, the sheer impossibility. "That's not SEALs didn't," the gunny corrected. "Past tense. She was Navy EOD first, then got picked up for a pilot program nobody talks about. This was back when everyone said it couldn't be done." He paused, watching the spot where Kestrel had vanished. "She made it through Hell Week with a stress fracture in her shin. Didn't say a word about it until after she'd earned her trident. Medical found it during her post-training physical." Johnson felt reality tilting. But women weren't allowed officially, still aren't, not for the teams. But there are programs, quiet ones, where capability matters more than gender. She was in the first. The gunny's voice dropped lower. "Know how she got the call sign Kestrel?" Johnson shook his head, grateful for any information that might help him understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Operation in the Strait of Hormuz, back when she was still a lieutenant flying FA-18s off the Roosevelt. Iranian patrol boats had cornered a SEAL extraction, and the air support was 15 minutes out. She was doing a training run nearby, saw the flash traffic, and violated about 60 protocols to get there first." The gunny's eyes held a distant look, the expression of someone recounting legends. "Came in so low the Iranians thought she was going to auger into the water. Made 3 passes, guns only, no missiles, because the SEALs were too close. Walked her ordnance so precisely, she took out 4 boats without touching friendlies. The team lead said she hunted those boats like a kestrel taking mice, hence the call sign." Johnson absorbed this, trying to reconcile the quiet woman in civilian clothes with the image forming in his mind. "And now she commands all of them." "Now she commands all of them," the gunny confirmed. "Every team, every operation, every spec ops sailor in the naval service answers to her. She's got the president's ear, coordinates with JSOC, and sits in the situation room when things go sideways." He turned his attention back to Johnson. "So when I say you got lucky that she's got a reputation for being fair, I mean you got cosmically, impossibly lucky. Some flag officers would have had your stripes for that." Johnson swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I should apologize. You should do your job and forget this happened. She already has." But she hadn't, not entirely. 3 hours later, as the sun hung low over Hampton Roads, and the ceremony concluded with the precision of a Swiss watch, Admiral Kestrel stood in a climate-controlled conference room deep inside the base headquarters, surrounded by men in uniform who collectively commanded America's maritime killing power. Maps glowed on digital displays, satellite imagery refreshed in real time, and the conversation dealt in abstractions that meant life or death for operators in the field. She listened more than she spoke, her presence a gravitational force that bent the room's energy toward her when she did choose to contribute. A captain was mid-briefing on readiness metrics when her phone vibrated silently in her pocket. She glanced at the screen, saw the message from Richards, and allowed herself the smallest smile. The corporal at the gate had filed an incident report, documenting his error with the kind of brutal honesty that suggested character. She appreciated that. Too many people try to hide their mistakes, to spin them, to find someone else to blame. This young Marine had owned his completely, requested formal counseling, and noted in his own words that he'd failed to maintain adequate situational awareness despite the Admiral's civilian attire. She typed a brief response to Richards. Closed the report with no action. He did what he was trained to do. If anything, it confirms our security protocols work. The meeting continued, talk turning to insertion platforms and weather windows, the eternal calculus of getting shooters where they needed to be without getting them killed in the process. Kestrel's mind tracked multiple threads simultaneously, seeing the board several moves ahead the way good chess players do, anticipating complications before they materialized. This was her gift, the thing that had elevated her beyond the cockpit and the tactical level to the strategic realm where wars were shaped. Not just the ability to fly or shoot or survive, but to see the whole picture, to understand how pieces connected across domains and time zones and chain of command hierarchies. When the meeting concluded, she remained behind as the others filed out, their conversations continuing into the hallway. Richards lingered, knowing her patterns, waiting for whatever thought had made her eyes go distant during the logistics discussion. "The corporal," she said finally, still looking at the maps. "Johnson, what do you know about him?" Richards pulled the information effortlessly from memory. 6 years in, 2 combat tour, exemplary record, scout sniper qualified, was being considered for MSG duty before this incident. Why? Because he didn't freeze. When he realized his mistake, his training kicked in faster than his fear. That's rare. She turned from the maps, her expression thoughtful. Have his chain of command watch him. If he maintains that trajectory, maybe point him toward MARSOC selection. We need people who can think and react simultaneously. Richards made a note on his tablet, unsurprised. This was classic Kestrel, finding potential in unexpected places, seeing capabilities others missed. "The congressman from Florida is still asking for a meeting," he said, changing subjects. "Wants to discuss the budget for the new SWCC boats. Tell him I'll be in D.C. on Thursday. 30 minutes, not a minute more." Her tone indicated what she thought of politicians who believed committee assignments made them defense experts. "And make sure he understands I'm there to discuss operational requirements, not procurement politics. If he wants to debate contract awards, he can talk to acquisition." Richards allowed himself a small smile. "He's not going to like that. He's not supposed to. He's supposed to fund the boats my people need to do their jobs." She gathered her materials, the meeting clearly over in her mind even if it wasn't formally concluded. "Anything else I need to know before tomorrow?" Tomorrow was the real reason she'd come to Norfolk. Not the ceremony, not the speeches, but a classified briefing on a developing situation in the South China Sea that had PACOM nervous and the SEALs prepositioning assets. Richards hesitated, which made her stop and give him her full attention. When her intel officer hesitated, it meant something bad. "There's chatter about a potential hostage situation," he said carefully. "American maritime contractors survey ship operating in disputed waters. The details are still fuzzy, but it's got the hallmarks of something that might require a direct action package." Kestrel felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the operational calculus already beginning. How fuzzy? Fuzzy enough that state is still saying it's probably nothing. Fuzzy enough that JSOC is spinning up contingencies. Which meant it was serious, possibly critical, and definitely the kind of situation that would land on her desk the moment it transitioned from monitoring to developing. "Keep me updated. If this goes from yellow to red, I want to know before CNN does." She paused at the door. "And Richards, make sure our people know I don't care what the official channels say. If they need support, if they need assets, they call me directly. We don't wait for perfect information when lives are on the line." He nodded, understanding perfectly. This was what separated Kestrel from other flag officers, this willingness to bet her career on the decisions that kept operators alive. She'd been where they were, had felt the isolation of being behind enemy lines with only your team and your training between you and a body bag. That memory never left her, never faded, and it informed every choice she made in this building. The walk back through the base took her past the flight line, where FA-18 Super Hornets sat in neat rows, their paintwork gleaming under floodlights as the evening shift performed maintenance. She stopped despite herself, drawn by the aircraft the way some people were drawn to music or art. This had been her first love before the trident, before the stars on her collar. The pure physics of it, the way metal and thrust and aerodynamics conspired to defy gravity. She'd logged over 2,000 hours in tactical aircraft, and there were still moments when her hands itched for the stick, when the confines of flag officer administration felt like a cage. A young lieutenant noticed her standing there and approached with the cautious respect junior officers showed senior ones, unsure if the interruption would be welcome. "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" Kestrel smiled, recognizing the type immediately, probably fresh from the rag, still carrying that new pilot energy, eager and terrified in equal measure. "Just remembering," she said simply. "I used to fly Rhinos off the Roosevelt. You strike Eagles, ma'am. Well, training for them, I'm transitioning from the T-45s." The lieutenant's eyes widened slightly as he processed the stars on the credentials hanging from her neck. "Wait, you're your Admiral Kestrel." The name recognition still felt strange. She'd spent so many years being just another aviator, just another face in the ready room, that having her call sign become synonymous with her rank felt like wearing someone else's uniform. "Guilty," she said. "You like it, the flying?" "Yes, ma'am, it's everything I thought it would be." The answer came without hesitation, and she appreciated the honesty. Some pilots tried to sound jaded, like the danger and difficulty didn't excite them, but the best ones embraced the addiction openly. "Good. Keep that feeling. The day you stop loving it is the day you become dangerous to yourself and your wingman." She started to walk away, then turned back. "And Lieutenant, when you get to the fleet, remember that the aircraft is just a tool. Your job isn't to fly pretty or put on a show. It's to bring ordnance on target and bring your people home. Everything else is just noise." He stood straighter, absorbing the words with the gravity they deserved. "Yes, ma'am, I will." She left him there among the jets and walked toward the parking area where her driver waited. The sun had finally set, leaving Norfolk under that particular purple twilight that marked the transition from day to operations, when the base shifted from its public face to its working reality. Somewhere in that darkness, sailors were loading ships, Marines were running drills, and in classified spaces buried under reinforced concrete, analysts were tracking threats that would never make the evening news. This was her world now, not the cockpit but the commander's chair, not the tactical but the strategic. She traded the immediate rush of combat for the slower burn of responsibility, and most days she believed it was worth it. Most days she told herself that she could do more good here, shaping policy and protecting her people from the bureaucratic fights that could kill as surely as enemy fire. But some days, watching those Super Hornets sit idle on the flight line, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The driver, a petty officer who'd learned not to attempt small talk, delivered her to the BOQ in silence. Her room was functional and anonymous, the kind of space that could belong to anyone and therefore belong to no one. She spent an hour on secure communications, reviewing intelligence updates, approving operational requests, denying budget reallocations that would have left her teams under-resourced to fund someone's pet project. The work was endless, a hydra that grew new heads as fast as she could cut them off, but it was also necessary. Every decision she made, every form she signed, every call she took affected real people doing real jobs in real danger. Around midnight, her secure phone rang with a tone that made her blood run cold. The distinctive pattern meant JSOC, and JSOC didn't call at midnight with good news. She answered on the second ring. "Kestrel. Ma'am, this is the operations center. The situation in the South China Sea just went red. We have confirmation of 12 American hostages, maritime contractors taken from the survey vessel Pacific Explorer approximately 6 hours ago. The ship is adrift in international waters, crew compartments are empty, and we're tracking a vessel matching known pirate configurations heading toward Filipino territorial waters." She was already moving, pulling her uniform from the closet, her mind shifting into the operational mode that had been forged in combat and refined through countless crises. "What's the timeline on territorial waters?" 90 minutes, maybe less depending on speed. Once they cross that line, This becomes a diplomatic nightmare instead of a military option, which meant they had an hour and a half to mount a rescue operation, get shooters on target, and extract the hostages before this turned into a protracted negotiation where Americans died slowly in captivity while politicians argued jurisdiction. Spin up the alert squadron. I want options in 30 minutes and a full briefing in 60. Get me a direct line to PACOM and pull the satellite feeds. If those hostages cross into Filipino waters, we're going to need permission to operate, and we're going to need it faster than the normal channels allow. Yes, ma'am. The package is already being assembled. Of course it was. Her people knew how she operated, knew that when she said she wanted to know before CNN, she meant she wanted to be ready to act before the situation became public knowledge. She finished dressing, checked her sidearm more from habit than necessity, and headed for the door. The night had just started, and before the sun rose again, she would make decisions that determined whether 12 Americans came home alive or in flag-draped boxes. This was the burden of command, the weight that made those stars on her collar feel like anchors sometimes. But it was also the privilege. Somewhere in the Pacific, operators were checking their gear, running through rehearsals for a mission they'd been preparing for their entire careers. And at the center of that preparation, coordinating the moving pieces, stood the woman those same operators called Kestrel, not because of her rank, but because she'd proven in fire and blood that she could hunt like one. The command center at Norfolk had been transformed when she arrived 20 minutes later. Screens showed real-time satellite imagery, thermal overlays, known vessel tracking, and the slowly updating positions of friendly forces. A dozen officers and senior enlisted moved with controlled urgency, voices calm but carrying the tension of people who understood the stakes. Captain Richards materialized at her elbow with a tablet and a situation summary. Pacific Explorer departed Manila 3 days ago on a geological survey contract. 12-person crew, all American, conducting seafloor mapping in international waters approximately 40 miles from Palawan. At 2200 local time, the ship went silent. Filipino Coast Guard located the vessel adrift at 0130 and reported all compartments empty, no signs of struggle, no damage to the ship itself. Kestrel absorbed the information, her eyes tracking the display. No signs of struggle means they were taken quickly, probably at gunpoint while the ship was stationary. What was their last transmission? Standard check-in with the contracting company, nothing unusual. Weather was calm, seas were flat. They should have been conducting normal operations. She moved closer to the primary display, studying the projected course of the suspect vessel. What do we know about the Tango boat? 50-foot motor vessel, configuration matches known Abu Sayyaf operating patterns. They've been running similar ops in the region for the past 18 months. Grab foreign nationals, move them to jungle camps in Mindanao, hold them for ransom. The Filipino government has limited capacity to respond, and the hostages usually end up dead or released after months of negotiation. Not this time. Her voice carried absolute conviction. Not on my watch. What assets do we have in range? A lieutenant commander at the operations desk spoke up. SEAL Team 5 has a troop in Okinawa, 8 hours out by air. We can have them boots on ground in the Philippines in 12 hours with support. The Lincoln Carrier Group is 400 miles south but can launch within the hour. Not good enough. The hostages will be in Filipino territory long before we can intercept. She studied the map, her mind running through possibilities, discarding options as quickly as they formed. What about local assets? Do we have anyone closer? Richards hesitated. There's a maritime security response team conducting training exercises with Filipino naval forces in Subic Bay. 2 platoons, full gear, they're technically in-country already. MSRT, Coast Guard. When Richards nodded, she felt the pieces clicking together. They're good, but this isn't their usual playground. What's their code like? Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, 10-year veteran, former TACLET operator. She's run hostile boardings in the Persian Gulf, done counter-narcotics in the Caribbean. Her people are solid. Kestrel made a decision that would either save 12 lives or end her career. Get me Commander Chen on secure comms. If she's willing and her team is capable, they're our best shot. They're already in country, they've got the right equipment, and most importantly, they're close enough to intercept before that boat reaches territorial waters. The room went quiet. What she was proposing violated about 15 different protocols, stepped on multiple chain-of-command toes, and would require approvals that normally took hours to secure. But Kestrel hadn't climbed to 3 stars by following the safe path. She'd done it by making the hard calls when lives hung in the balance. "Ma'am," Richard said carefully, "the Coast Guard operates under DHS authority, not DOD. Getting them approved for direct action against hostile forces is my problem, not yours. Get me that connection and start drafting the authorization package. I'll have the Pentagon on the line in 5 minutes, and if I have to wake the secretary, I'll wake the secretary. Those 12 Americans don't care about organizational charts. They care about going home alive." The connection took 3 minutes. When Commander Chen's face appeared on the secure video feed, Kestrel saw exactly what she'd hoped to see. A competent professional who understood immediately that this wasn't a social call. "Commander Chen, this is Vice Admiral Kestrel, NAVSBCWAR. You've been briefed on the Pacific Explorer situation." "Yes, ma'am, we're tracking it." Filipino Command is scrambling response assets, but they're looking at a 4-hour window minimum to get boats in position, which is 3 hours too long. I need to know if your team is capable of conducting a hostile interdiction and hostage rescue in international waters within the next 90 minutes. Chen's expression didn't change, but Kestrel saw the calculations happening behind her eyes, the mental checklist of capabilities and limitations being run at high speed. "Ma'am, my people can do it. We've got the boats, the weapons, and the training, but I need to be clear about the authorization. MSRT doesn't typically. I'm working the authorization now. What I need from you is an honest assessment. Can you get your team to that vessel before it reaches Filipino territorial waters? And can you successfully execute a rescue operation against an unknown number of hostiles without getting my people killed?" The question hung in the digital space between them, and Kestrel watched Chen process it with the seriousness it deserved. This wasn't bravado being requested. It was capability. "Yes, ma'am. We can do it." 3 words delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who'd proven themselves in situations where failure meant death. Kestrel felt something in her chest loosen slightly. "Then here's what's going to happen. You're going to receive operational tasking within the next 15 minutes from PACOM with my authorization attached. You'll have full support satellite tracking, signals intelligence, air cover if you need it. But Commander, this is a rescue operation, not a demonstration. I need those hostages alive, your people alive, and if possible, I need those tangos alive for interrogation. Can you work with those parameters?" "Understood, ma'am. Alive is the priority." "Good. Richards will be your direct contact for intel updates. You run your operation, I'll handle the politics. And Commander," Kestrel leaned closer to the camera, "the reason I'm giving you this mission instead of waiting for the teams is because you're there and you're capable. Don't make me regret that assessment." "No, ma'am. You won't." The connection terminated, and Kestrel was already moving to the next task, her phone pressed to her ear as she navigated the labyrinth of approvals needed to put Coast Guard operators in harm's way under Navy operational control. The conversations were terse, professional, and in 2 cases heated. A rear admiral at PACOM questioned whether MSRT had the capability for direct action. She reminded him that Coast Guard TACLET operators conducted armed boardings in hostile waters as standard procedure, and asked if he wanted to explain to the families why he delayed a rescue over jurisdictional concerns. The Deputy Secretary of Defense wanted assurances that this wouldn't turn into another Black Hawk Down situation. She gave him a tactical breakdown that demonstrated why a small, fast team had better odds than a large conventional force, and reminded him that every minute they debated, Americans moved closer to captivity. By the time Commander Chen's boats were in the water, Kestrel had secured the approvals, established the chain of command, and arranged for a Predator drone to provide overwatch with authorization to engage if the tactical situation required it. She'd also called in favors from 3 different flag officers and promised testimony before a congressional committee that would probably be hostile. But the mission was authorized, the operators were moving, and 12 Americans had a chance they wouldn't have had if she'd followed the safe bureaucratic path. She settled into the command center, her eyes fixed on the displays showing Chen's boats as small blue icons moving across dark water, and allowed herself a moment of doubt that she would never show to anyone else in this room. She just bet her career, and possibly the lives of Coast Guard operators on a mission that violated standard procedures in about 15 different ways. If this worked, maybe a dozen people would know the details and she'd be quietly commended. If it failed, her name would be attached to a disaster that would be studied in military leadership courses for decades. The doubt lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then training reasserted itself, and she began coordinating the support packages that would give Chen the best chance of success. This was command. Not the glory, not the medals, but the weight of decisions made in imperfect circumstances with incomplete information. And somewhere over the Pacific, Chen and her team were racing toward a confrontation that would either validate Kestrel's faith or destroy it completely. The boats were RHIB's rigid hull inflatable boats purpose-built for exactly this kind of operation. Fast, stable, and equipped with mounted weapons that could shred an unarmored vessel in seconds. Commander Chen stood in the lead boat, one hand on the rail, her eyes scanning the darkness ahead where their target moved, unaware that 20 highly trained operators were closing at 40 knots with authorization to use deadly force. Her team was good. She knew it because she'd trained them personally, had weeded out the ones who couldn't handle the pressure, and cultivated the ones who thrived in the chaos. They'd done hostile boardings in the Persian Gulf, where one wrong move meant Iranian gunboats converging on their position. They'd interdicted drug runners in Caribbean waters, where the smugglers fought back with automatic weapons and homemade explosives. This was different in scale but not in kind, and she trusted her people to adapt to the environment. The intel package from Norfolk was updating in real time on her tablet, showing the target vessel's position, speed, and projected course. The Filipino Coast Guard had maintained a discreet distance, marking the target without spooking it, giving Chen's team the element of surprise. Satellite imagery showed 12 heat signatures in the cabin area, clustered together in what appeared to be a cargo hold. The hostages, probably bound and guarded. Another 6 signatures moved on deck, patterns consistent with armed personnel maintaining watch. Chen had seen enough hostage situations to know the next 12 hours were critical. Once the hostages reached land, once they were dispersed into jungle camps or urban safe houses, the rescue calculus became exponentially harder. But here, on the water in international space, with the enemy consolidated and the hostages in one location, they had a chance. 5 minutes, her XO called out, and Chen felt the familiar pre-combat focus settle over her like a second skin. Fear didn't disappear. Anyone who said they weren't afraid before a gunfight was either lying or dangerous, but it became manageable, channeled into heightened awareness and precision. She keyed her radio to the frequency that connected her directly to Norfolk, to Admiral Kestrel's command center. Nomad 1 to Overwatch, we are 5 minutes from intercept. Target is holding steady on course, no indication they're aware of our approach. Kestrel's voice came back instantly, calm and clear. Overwatch copies. Predator is overhead with thermal imaging. Confirm rules of engagement. Row confirmed. Rescue the hostages, preserve life where possible, use necessary force to neutralize threats. You have authorization for lethal force if hostages are in imminent danger. Trust your judgment, Commander. You're the eyes on target. The connection stayed open, and Chen appreciated that. Some flag officers micromanaged from thousands of miles away, questioning every tactical decision, demanding explanations that wasted precious seconds. Kestrel had given her the mission parameters and then stepped back, trusting Chen to execute. That trust was worth more than air support. The target vessel came into view through the night vision optics, a dark shape riding low in the water, its running lights extinguished in violation of maritime regulations that meant nothing to pirates. Chen could see figures moving on deck, silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky, and her trained eye picked out the weapons they carried: AK-pattern rifles, probably AK-47s or Chinese variants, the weapon of choice for irregular forces worldwide. "Spread formation," she ordered quietly, and the RHIBs separated into a pincer approach, one from each side, cutting off any escape route. The sound of their engines was lost in the wind and waves until they were close enough that suppression mattered more than stealth. Then they opened the throttles fully, and the boats surged forward like predators who'd spotted prey. The first indication the pirates had that something was wrong came when spotlights hit them from both sides simultaneously, turning night into day and destroying their night vision in an instant. Chen's voice, amplified through a loudspeaker, cut through the engine roar in clear, if accented, Tagalog. "This is the United States Coast Guard. Cut your engines and prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will be met with lethal force." For about 3 seconds the tableau held, the pirates frozen in the lights, Chen's team approaching with weapons trained, the universe balanced on the edge between surrender and violence. Then one of the pirates raised his rifle, and the choice was made for them. The mounted M240 on Chen's boat opened up with a sound like the world tearing in half, tracer rounds walking across the deck in a precise arc that avoided the cabin where the hostages were held but cut down the armed man before he could fire. The other pirates scattered, some diving for cover, others bringing their own weapons to bear, and suddenly the night erupted into chaos. Chen's team had trained for this exact scenario hundreds of times. While the machine guns suppressed the deck, the boats came alongside with coordinated precision. Operators launched grappling hooks, secured lines, and began boarding procedures with the smooth efficiency of people who'd done this so many times it was muscle memory. Chen was among the first over the rail, her rifle up and ready, sweeping for targets. A pirate emerged from behind a cargo container, his AK coming up, and she put 2 rounds center mass before he could complete the motion. He went down hard, the rifle clattering across the deck, and she was already moving past him, clearing angles, calling out positions. Her team flowed through the vessel like water, each operator covering sectors, communicating with hand signals and brief radio calls. They encountered 2 more armed hostiles on the deck level, both of whom chose to fight rather than surrender. The engagements were brief and professional, over in seconds, the operators moving with the precision that came from years of training and the absolute certainty that hesitation meant death. The cabin where the hostages were held presented a different problem. Chen stacked her team outside the door, 4 operators ready to breach, while others maintained security on the rest of the vessel. Through the thin walls they could hear voices agitated, arguing in a mix of Tagalog and what might have been Arabic, and underneath that, the quieter sounds of people trying very hard not to draw attention to themselves. The hostages, still alive. She keyed her radio. "Overwatch, we have secured the deck, preparing to breach the cabin. Thermal imaging shows 6 tangos with the hostages, weapons probable." Kestrel's response carried the tension of someone watching events unfold from thousands of miles away with no ability to intervene. Predator confirms. "You have 2 tangos near the door, 4 deeper in the space with the hostages. Recommend flashbang entry to minimize casualties." "Copy that. Breaching now." Chen pulled a flashbang grenade from her vest, nodded to her team, and the door came off its hinges with a kick that would have done credit to a professional athlete. The grenade went in high, detonating with a concussive blast that turned the confined space into a sensory nightmare for anyone without protection. Then her team was inside, moving through the smoke and confusion with their weapons up, identifying threats, separating them from hostages. 2 pirates were on the floor, disoriented by the blast, hands instinctively going for weapons that Chen's team kicked away before they could recover. A third tried to use a hostage as a shield, pressing a pistol to an American's head, screaming something in Tagalog that Chen didn't need to understand to know was a demand for withdrawal. Her operator, a senior chief named Martinez who'd been doing this since before Chen graduated from the academy, took the shot. One round, precisely placed through the pirate's temple from an angle that ensured the bullet wouldn't endanger the hostage. The pirate dropped, and the American civilian collapsed to his knees, alive but probably scarred for life by how close that had been. The remaining pirates, seeing their situation, chose survival over defiance and went to their knees with their hands up. Chen's team secured them with zip ties while others began checking the hostages, assessing injuries, providing water and reassurance. 12 Americans, ranging from their 20s to their 50s, all alive, all terrified but fundamentally intact. Overwatch, this is Nomad 1. We have all 12 hostages secured, alive and ambulatory. 6 tangos in custody, 4 KIA, no friendly casualties. The relief in Kestrel's voice was audible even over the encrypted connection. Outstanding work, Commander. Filipino authorities are being notified, and we have an extraction helicopter inbound to your location. ETA 20 minutes. Chen allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the adrenaline beginning to ebb as the tactical situation transitioned from combat to recovery. Around her, her team maintained their professional demeanor, but she could see the subtle signs of relief, the slight relaxation in shoulders, the careful smiles exchanged when they thought no one was looking. They'd done it, pulled off a hostile rescue in international waters against armed opposition and brought everyone home alive. This was what they'd trained for, what they'd dedicated their lives to being able to do, and in this moment it had mattered. 20 minutes later, as the helicopter lifted off with the hostages and Chen remained behind to coordinate the handover of the vessel and prisoners to Filipino authorities, her radio crackled with a different voice. Commander Chen, this is Admiral Kestrel. I wanted to speak to you directly before the formal debriefs begin. Chen straightened instinctively despite being on an open deck with no one to see. Yes, ma'am. What you and your team accomplished tonight was exceptional. You executed a complex operation with limited preparation against an unknown force and brought every American home alive. That's the definition of success, and I wanted you to know that your actions tonight will be recognized, even if the recognition has to remain classified. Thank you, ma'am. Your team performed exactly as you trained them to, which means you prepared them correctly. That reflects on your leadership, Commander, and it's why I felt confident giving you this mission. There was a pause, and when Kestrel continued, her voice carried a different quality, something more personal. I know what it's like to be in that position, to have people question whether you're capable because you don't fit their mental image of what an operator should look like. You proved tonight that capability has nothing to do with what others expect and everything to do with what you can deliver when it matters. Remember that, and make sure your people remember it too. The connection terminated, leaving Chen standing on the deck of a pirate vessel in the middle of the Pacific, processing words from an admiral she'd never met but who apparently understood exactly what it meant to operate in spaces where your presence challenged assumptions. She thought about the corporal at Norfolk who'd stopped Kestrel at a checkpoint, not recognizing that the quiet woman in civilian clothes commanded every special operations sailor in the service. Thought about her own experiences of being underestimated, of having to prove herself again and again in rooms full of people who assumed she'd gotten there through some combination of luck and lowered standards, rather than the same grueling path they'd walked. And she thought about her team, good operators who'd followed her into a gunfight because they trusted her judgment, and who'd executed flawlessly because she'd trained them to a standard that left no room for doubt. As the sun began to rise over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if she wasn't exhausted and standing on a blood-stained deck, Chen made a decision. She would remember this night not for the combat or the violence, but for the moment when a 3-star admiral had taken the time to remind her that the work mattered, that the struggle to prove capability in the face of skepticism was worth it. Back in Norfolk, Kestrel stood in the command center and watched the satellite feed showing the helicopter carrying the rescued hostages toward safety. Around her, the operations staff was already compiling the after-action reports, documenting decisions, preparing the briefings that would climb the chain of command, and ultimately reach the president's daily intelligence summary. But for a moment, she allowed herself to simply watch the screen and feel the weight of responsibility lift slightly. 12 lives saved. A team of Coast Guard operators who'd proven their worth in circumstances that would normally have called for SEALs. And maybe, just maybe, another small crack in the assumptions about who could operate at the highest levels of military special operations. Richards approached with a tablet full of messages that would require her attention, but he waited, recognizing the moment for what it was. When she turned from the screen, her expression had returned to the composed professionalism that was her default mode, but he'd worked with her long enough to see the satisfaction underneath. "The secretary wants a brief in 2 hours," he said. "PACOM is requesting a formal commendation for Commander Chen and her team, and you have about 40 message requests from various congressional offices who somehow heard there was an incident and want to know why they weren't informed before the operation. Tell the secretary I'll be ready. Draft the commendation paperwork for my signature, and tell the congressional offices that classified operations aren't subject to notification requirements, and they can read about it in the after-action report when it's declassified in 20 years. She paused. Also, make sure Commander Chen knows that if her career takes her toward a commission in the Navy, specifically towards special operations, that she should reach out to me directly. We need people with her capabilities and her experience." Richards made the notes, unsurprised by any of it. This was classic Kestrel, handling the bureaucratic fights with one hand while cultivating talent with the other, never forgetting that the purpose of all this machinery was to protect people and accomplish missions. "The corporal from the checkpoint yesterday," Richards said carefully. "He's been asking if there's anything he should do, any formal apology he needs to make." Kestrel shook her head. "He already filed an honest report, which is more than most people do when they make mistakes. Tell him the matter is closed and he should focus on his job. And Richards, make sure his chain of command knows that I consider the incident a demonstration of proper security protocols, not a failure. I don't want this following him." "Yes, ma'am." She left the command center as the sun climbed higher, heading back to the BOQ for a few hours of rest before the inevitable parade of briefings and meetings that would consume the next several days. In her room, she finally allowed herself to shed the uniform, to stand in the shower and let the hot water unknot muscles that had been tense for hours, and to think about the strange path that had brought her from the cockpit of an FA-18 to the command of all naval special warfare forces. She'd never intended to be a symbol or a barrier breaker. She just wanted to fly, to serve, to do the job she'd trained for to the best of her ability. But the world had other ideas about what her presence meant, and over the years she'd learned to carry that weight alongside the operational responsibilities. Sometimes people like Corporal Johnson would see her and not recognize the rank, would make assumptions based on appearance or expectations that had nothing to do with capability. And sometimes people like Commander Chen would need to be reminded that they'd earned their place, that the skepticism of others was a reflection of limited imagination rather than actual limitation. This was the invisible work of breaking barriers, not just doing the job, but doing it well enough that the next person had slightly less to prove, slightly more space to simply be competent without it being remarkable. Her phone buzzed with a message from an old teammate, someone she'd flown with back when she was just another lieutenant trying to make carrier landings in night weather conditions. The text was brief. "Saw the traffic about the hostage rescue. Heard it had your fingerprints on it. Nice work, Kestrel." She smiled at the use of her call sign, the name that had followed her from the cockpit through the teams and into the flag ranks. Kestrel, hunter. Someone who saw prey from impossible distances and struck with precision that looked effortless, but was actually the product of countless hours of practice and an almost obsessive attention to detail. That was who she was, underneath the stars and the ceremony. Someone who hunted problems and didn't stop until they were solved. The next few days blurred together in the way that classified operations always did. Briefings in secure facilities, discussions with people whose titles were more important than their understanding, and the constant low-grade stress of knowing that somewhere in the world, operators were in harm's way relying on the decisions she made in climate-controlled conference rooms. The hostage rescue became a footnote in classified reporting. 12 Americans safely returned to their families, the pirates in Filipino custody facing charges that would keep them in prison for the rest of their lives. Commander Chen received a classified commendation and a quiet message that doors were open if she wanted to pursue them. The corporal at Norfolk went back to his duties, probably still telling the story of the day he stopped a three-star admiral at a checkpoint and lived to tell about it. And Kestrel returned to the rhythm of command, the endless cycle of meetings and decisions, and the weight of responsibility that never fully lifted. But there were moments, usually late at night when the building was quiet and she was alone with her thoughts, when she would think about the young lieutenant at the flight line who'd asked if he could help her, who'd looked at the jets with the same love she'd once felt, still felt if she was honest. She thought about the path that had brought her here, the choices and chances and the sheer stubborn refusal to accept that there were some places she didn't belong. She thought about the women who'd come before her, the ones who'd fought battles she'd never know about so that she could fight her own. And she thought about the women who'd come after, the ones for whom her presence might make the path slightly easier, the questions slightly less skeptical, the assumptions slightly less limiting. This was the legacy she was building, whether she'd intended to or not. Not just the missions and the medals and the operational successes, but the slow expansion of what was possible, the gradual redefinition of who could hunt in these particular skis. One evening, about a week after the hostage rescue, she found herself back at Norfolk for a different ceremony, this one public and carefully choreographed. A change of command, the passing of responsibility from one officer to another, the kind of event that filled an auditorium with dress uniforms and formal speeches. She sat on the stage as the presiding officer, her role to oversee the transition and lend the weight of her position to the proceedings. The outgoing commander gave his speech, thanking people and acknowledging service, the standard format that these things followed. The incoming commander took the podium and accepted the responsibility with the gravity it deserved. And then it was Kestrel's turn to speak, to offer the remarks that would officially close the ceremony and send everyone to the reception where the real conversations happened. She'd written the speech on the flight over, standard material about leadership and service and the importance of the mission. But standing at the podium, looking out at the assembled faces, officers and enlisted, veterans and active duty, people who dedicated their lives to something larger than themselves, she found herself deviating from the script. "I want to tell you about a young Marine I met recently," she began, and saw people settle in, recognizing that this wasn't going to be the standard flag officer remarks. He was doing his job, maintaining security at a checkpoint, when someone tried to enter a restricted area without proper credentials visible. He stopped them, firmly but professionally, and refused to back down even when the situation became uncomfortable. She could see people in the audience exchanging glances, wondering where this was going. The person he stopped was me. I was in civilian clothes, my credentials were in my pocket, and I looked like exactly what I was, someone who didn't belong in that particular space based on appearance alone. That Marine had every reason to let me through. I had the right credentials, I was clearly not a threat, and making me stop was awkward for everyone involved. She paused, letting the moment breathe. But he didn't let me through. He did his job exactly as he was trained to do it, and he did it correctly. Because security doesn't work if we make exceptions based on assumptions, if we let people through because they look like they belong, or because stopping them might be uncomfortable. It works when we apply the standards consistently, when we trust the training more than our instincts about who poses a threat. The room was quiet now, everyone tracking where she was going with this. That Marine taught me something important that day. He reminded me that doing the job right sometimes means making people uncomfortable. It means applying standards even when it's awkward, even when you might face criticism, even when the easy path is to make assumptions and hope they're correct. She looked directly at the incoming commander, but her words were for everyone present. You're going to face situations in this command where the easy path is clear and the right path is uncertain. Where making people uncomfortable, challenging assumptions, or insisting on standards will cost you politically or professionally. And in those moments, I want you to remember that young Marine at the checkpoint who did his job correctly despite every incentive to just wave me through. Because that's what service means. Not the ceremonies or the medals or the recognition, but the daily choice to do the hard thing correctly instead of the easy thing conveniently. And if you can maintain that standard, if you can build a command culture where people trust the process more than their assumptions, then you'll have succeeded in the ways that actually matter. The applause was polite but thoughtful, people processing what they'd heard. After the ceremony concluded, as people mingled with drinks and small talk, several officers approached her with questions about the story, wanting to know how she'd responded to the Marine, what had happened after. She kept the answers brief, not wanting to make Corporal Johnson's life harder by turning him into an anecdote, but the message had been delivered. Standards mattered, process mattered, and the willingness to apply them consistently, even when uncomfortable, was what separated professional military organizations from social clubs in uniform. Later that evening, back in her temporary quarters, she received an email that made her pause. It was from a lieutenant she'd met at Annapolis years ago, someone who'd washed out of flight school and transitioned to surface warfare. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." The message was longer than necessary but boiled down to a simple point. The lieutenant had been struggling with imposter syndrome, with the constant feeling that she didn't belong in her current role, that she was one mistake away from being exposed as inadequate. And hearing Kestrel talk about being stopped at a checkpoint, about situations where appearance and assumption diverged from reality, had somehow helped. Kestrel stared at the email for a long time, thinking about all the invisible weight that people carried, the internal battles that never showed up in fitness reports or efficiency ratings. She'd spent so much of her career focused on the external fights, the missions, the operations, the tangible demonstrations of capability, that it was easy to forget about the internal ones. The voice that whispered you don't belong here. The constant need to prove yourself worthy of a space you'd already earned. The exhaustion of operating in environments where your presence was always notable, always commented upon, never simply accepted as normal. She typed a response, keeping it brief because she suspected the lieutenant didn't want a sermon, just acknowledgement. You belong there because you earned it, the same way everyone else in your position earned it. The doubt you feel isn't unique to you, and it's not evidence that you're inadequate. It's evidence that you care about doing the job well. Use that energy to drive excellence, not to question your presence. And remember that everyone, including me, has moments where they feel like they're one mistake from exposure. The difference between people who succeed and people who don't isn't the absence of doubt, it's what they do with it. She hit send and sat back, wondering if the words would help or if they were just more noise in a world that had plenty already. Her phone rang, the distinctive pattern that meant JSOC again. She answered with a sense of resignation, knowing that midnight phone calls never brought good news. Kestrel, ma'am, we have a developing situation in East Africa. American embassy personnel in Mogadishu, reports of hostile action, evacuation protocols initiated. AFRICOM is requesting special operations support, and your name is on the tasking list. She closed her laptop, the email to the struggling lieutenant still on the screen. I'll be airborne in 2 hours. Send me the brief en route. This was the life, not the ceremonies or the speeches or the carefully managed public image, but the phone calls at midnight and the decisions made with incomplete information and the absolute certainty that lives depended on getting it right. She packed efficiently, muscle memory from years of rapid deployments, and thought about the corporal who'd stopped her at the checkpoint. He'd done his job without knowing who she was, without the context that might have made him hesitate. That was the standard she tried to maintain, doing what was right regardless of who was watching or what the consequences might be. Because in the end, that was what service meant. Not glory or recognition, but the willingness to stand at the checkpoint and apply the rules, to make the hard call when lives hung in the balance, to carry the weight of command even when it felt like too much. The car arrived to take her to the airfield, and she left Norfolk behind, heading toward another crisis, another operation, another night of watching screens and making decisions that would ripple through the lives of people she'd never meet. But as the lights of the base faded in the distance, she thought about the young lieutenant struggling with doubt, and about Commander Chen leading her team into a gunfight, and about the countless others who were fighting their own battles in the spaces between the headlines. This was her command. Not just the SEALs and the special boat crews and the formal organizational charts, but the invisible network of people who'd chosen to serve, who carried their own doubts and fears and determination, who got up every day and did the work despite every reason to choose an easier path. She couldn't fight all their battles, couldn't solve all their problems or smooth all their paths. But she could make the calls when it mattered, could use her position to open doors and clear obstacles and remind people that capability was what counted, not appearance or assumption or the weight of other people's expectations. The aircraft was waiting when she arrived, a C-37 that would have her in Djibouti before dawn. She boarded quickly, accepted the briefing materials from an aide, and settled into the configuration of screens and secure communications that turned the passenger cabin into a mobile command center. Somewhere over the Atlantic, reviewing intelligence reports about militia movements and evacuation routes, she allowed herself a moment of brutal honesty. She was tired. Tired of the fights, tired of the wait, tired of the constant need to prove that she belonged in rooms where people still sometimes looked at her and saw the wrong thing. But she was also the person who'd made it through Hell Week with a stress fracture, who'd flown combat missions in weather that grounded other pilots, who'd earned her trident and her wings and her stars through the same blood and sweat and determination as everyone else. And if being tired was the price of being in position to make decisions that saved lives and opened paths for others, then she'd pay it gladly and without complaint. The sun rose over Africa as her aircraft began its descent, painting the continent in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful if she wasn't reviewing casualty reports and extraction timelines. The situation in Mogadishu was deteriorating faster than expected, and the window for safe evacuation was closing. She'd spent the flight coordinating with AFRICOM, positioning assets, and gaming out contingencies for what happened if the embassy compound was overrun before they could get everyone out. Now, as the wheels touched down in Djibouti, she was stepping directly into the operational command of an evacuation that would either save American lives or become a case study in failure. The base commander met her on the tarmac, a brigadier general who'd worked with special operations long enough to know that when Kestrel showed up personally, the situation was serious. "Ma'am, welcome to Djibouti. We have your command center set up in the operations facility, and the teams are ready for tasking." She followed him into the climate-controlled spaces where modern warfare was waged, screens showing real-time surveillance, analysts tracking patterns, and operators checking equipment with the focused intensity of people who understood they might be in combat within hours. Her arrival caused a ripple of awareness, conversations pausing briefly as people registered her presence, but the work continued. Good. She wanted competence and focus, not ceremony. "Brief me," she said, and the operations officer began walking her through the situation. 27 Americans at the embassy, including the ambassador and a Marine security detachment. Militia forces had taken control of 3 major intersections between the embassy and the airport. Small arms fire had been reported near the compound perimeter. The Somali government, such as it was, had lost effective control of the situation. "What assets do we have in position?" SEAL Team 3, 1 platoon, arrived 6 hours ago. Marine Fast Company is spun up and ready to deploy. We have rotary wing support from the 160th SOAR and fixed wing on station for air cover. She studied the map, seeing the problem immediately. The most direct route to the embassy was through hostile territory, and fighting through would take time they didn't have and risk casualties they couldn't afford. The alternate routes were longer but potentially less defended. What's the status of the compound defenses? The Marines are solid, but they're light on ammunition and they've reported probes on the perimeter. The ambassador is requesting immediate evacuation, and state is backing him up. We have a window of maybe 6 hours before this turns into Benghazi. 6 hours. She ran the numbers, the timeline, the moving pieces that all had to align perfectly or people died. Here's what we're going to do. The SEALs will insert by helo directly into the compound, reinforce the Marines, and establish a secure perimeter. While they're doing that, we're going to run a diversionary operation on the main road to pull militia attention away from the alternate route. Then we extract everyone by helicopter from the compound courtyard, straight to the airport, no ground movement through hostile streets. The operations officer looked skeptical. "Ma'am, inserting directly into the compound puts our helos at risk from ground fire, and the courtyard is tight. We'll need multiple lifts to get everyone out. Which is why we do it fast and we do it with overwhelming support. I want gunships overhead, drones providing real-time surveillance, and the fast company stage to provide QRF if anything goes wrong. We're not going to lose people because we chose the safe option that took too long." She looked around the room, meeting eyes, making sure everyone understood this wasn't a discussion but a decision. "I know the risks. I'm accepting them. Now let's make it work." The next 6 hours were a masterclass in controlled chaos. Kestrel positioned herself in the operations center, coordinating the moving pieces, watching the screens that showed her team's positioning for insertion. The SEAL platoon leader, a lieutenant commander named Reeves, checked in from the helicopter that would take him into the compound. "Overwatch, this is Trident 6. We're 5 minutes from insertion. Compound is taking sporadic fire from the north. Marines report they're holding, but ammunition is getting critical." "Copy that, Trident 6. Be advised, we have eyes on militia movement 3 blocks north of your position. Recommend immediate suppression on landing." The helicopters went in low and fast, their door gunners engaging anything that looked like a threat, the sound of their rotors echoing off buildings that had seen too much violence in their history. Kestrel watched the thermal imagery as the SEALs fast-roped into the compound, their movements precise and professional, years of training compressed into seconds of execution. The Marines at the compound, who'd been holding a deteriorating position for hours, rallied at the sight of reinforcements. Within minutes, the perimeter was secured, the fields of fire were established, and the embassy staff were being marshaled for evacuation. But the militia forces weren't cooperating with the timeline. As the first helicopter came in for the extraction lift, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, tracers arcing across the night sky like deadly fireflies. One round punched through the helicopter's tail rotor, and the pilot fought to maintain control as warning lights lit up his instrument panel. "Taking fire. I've got damage to the tail rotor. Handling is degraded." The pilot's voice was professionally calm despite reporting a situation that could turn fatal in seconds. Kestrel made a decision that would either save the operation or doom it. "All units, weapons free on the northern sector. Light it up." The gunships that had been circling in Overwatch dove toward the threat, their miniguns and rockets turning the militia positions into a hellscape of fire and fragmentation. The volume of return fire dropped immediately as the enemy discovered that shooting at helicopters had consequences. The damaged bird managed to land in the compound, disgorge its passengers, and limp toward the airport with a flight profile that made everyone watching hold their breath. But it made it, and that was what mattered. The subsequent lifts went faster, the pilots pushing their aircraft to the limits while the SEALs and Marines provided suppressing fire that kept enemy heads down. Kestrel tracked each departure, each successful landing at the airport, each American life moved from the danger zone to relative safety. 27 people. That was the count she cared about. Not the strategic implications or the geopolitical ramifications, but 27 Americans who would go home to their families instead of becoming statistics in another failed evacuation. When the last helicopter cleared the compound with Reeves and his SEALs aboard, she allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time in 6 hours. Overwatch to all units, operation complete. All personnel accounted for, all Americans secure. Outstanding work. The operations center erupted in subdued celebration, people allowing themselves to feel the relief and satisfaction of a mission accomplished. But Kestrel was already thinking about the after-action, about the helicopter that had taken damage and the implications for future operations, about the gaps in intelligence